Looking at the multiple screens on my computer, I could see the multiple groups that are scattered around the planet, those that showed up through this distortion. Groups of skeletal robots emanating some sort of strange green energy, screaming, bulky green humanoids that seemed to make everything out of scrap, their weapons, their armor, everything. Giant insectoids that seem to screech every time before they strike. Robotic humanoids not too unlike those we already have. Tall, thin armored elves that seem to use swords and magic, and massive humans in bulky armor covered in decorations. Along with that, their slightly smaller compatriots. They all seem to be supported by their own vessels that are all distinctly different. Yet one stood out as a cross between an old mausoleum, a crypt, and one of those old ironclads from back in the day. The guns seem to never stop, as each group is hell-bent on destroying each other once they even spot one another. Hearing weapons firing outside, I'm brought out of my shock of what I'm seeing on each of these screens. Turning to the blue-skinned beauty leaning over my shoulder, I pulled my head back as I was about to actually be face to face, or even millimeters to her chest. I said, "Though I'm enjoying the view, go put something on, and grab that rifle of yours. I'm gonna do what the man says." "What's that?" she asked. "Suit up." Running to the barn as fast as I can, I ran right into the RV and got everything started up. While it went through its startup processes, I got the nanosuit on. Thankfully, the closet that puts this on is automated too, because, geez, I'd hate to put it on just by myself. It's harder to put on and take off manually than a frickin' wetsuit, for crying out loud. Stepping into position, the machine began to move me around and it strapped the plates onto the nanosuit. Once the helmet is on, the cool sensation entered my head and the machine released me. Strapping my weapons on, I hurried out of the barn just in time to see our local dragon mommy pull in with her daughter. Behind was one of my siblings with their kids. Thankfully, they had listened to me, and they were actually pulling in with the trailer absolutely jam-packed with supplies. They were actually more than surprised to see me in the suit, so much that they actually drew their weapons. They didn't know who I was. I had to remove the helmet before they actually calmed down, no matter how much I let my voice go. We all know voice changers are a thing, and they weren't taking any chances. Of course, it doesn't hurt if you have a seductive European femme fatale yelling at them from the porch. That helped as she just basically stood there and screamed, "It's him!" Nobody wanted to argue once she started screaming, because just looking at her made all the women, well, let's just say jealous. And because of that, they got quiet. And of course, the booby window letting her wampon show got all the men to be quiet, probably due to their hunting instincts kicking in. Walking back to the house, I told everybody to stack their supplies in the basement. They already knew where, as I had sent them a floor plan long beforehand. Sitting inside, I saw the girls were actually still asleep. Seeing them both filling up the entire bed made me realize I need to get a bigger one, but that sort of shit, that's gonna have to wait. My niece's boyfriend, a man who now had inherent parkour abilities, began yelling about there's trouble outside, there's trouble. Grabbing my pistols, I ran out to see a group of skeletal robots with some green light emanating from them. I turned just in time to see one of them use the energy weapon on my neighbor's dog. The Mastiff was tossed backwards from the force, and when it hit the ground, it seemed to dissolve into ash and vaporize into nothing. I simply said, "Well, they're not friendly." With that, I motioned everybody to stay in the house. As the skeleton robots fired into the neighbor's house, I moved up to the stone wall, getting into position. I could see on my HUD where everyone is. Enemies are highlighted in red, and friendlies are in yellow. No one's going to be able to sneak up on me, and plus, I'll know exactly where they are. As two of the skeleton robots moved to the front of the neighbor's house, I put a long burst through the back of one. The 7.62 by 51 millimeter bullets cut right through it, making it fall over and falling to pieces as the green energy just seemed to come out and dissipate, kind of like a nasty fart. The second skeleton turned to look at me and found a single high-velocity bullet blowing its skull apart. In slow motion, the green light seemed to fade and the body just fell over before landing and breaking apart. I turned to the pretty blue bird in the trees watching over me and gave her a quick nod. I wanted to go back to the house and double check on everybody and to see what was happening around the world. That is when I heard the voice. A calming woman's voice with a very thick southern accent. Looking around to see who was talking, I heard her say, "No time to worry about that, sweetheart. You got trouble a-comin'." Looking on my HUD, I could see the voice was right. Reloading the magazine, I turned and yelled up to the trees, "I'll be right back!" Then, realizing she was actually standing right behind me. So much for no one sneaking up on me. Though she actually thought it was a bit funny, realizing that she had not quite lost her touch with all the downtime. I reminded her that the other family and friends were coming and they need to be ready and they need to be protected. Hesitantly, she went back to the house, and I turned and headed straight into the forest right towards trouble. I kept one eye on my HUD as I bolted through the forest as fast as I could, jumping over logs and creeks and eventually seeing something very interesting. The robotic skeletons were being held off by our own robotic residents. The friendlies seemed immune to the green energy being fired at them, shaking it off in a few seconds with barely any degrades on them at all. Along with that, the neighborhood had all come to play. A mixture of magic and technology seemed to overwhelm the massive group of skeleton bots, at least half of which are actually now on the ground in pieces and I haven't even fired a shot yet. The only problem were the small volleyball-sized green bug-type robots. Yet, when they swarmed me, the energy shield built into this suit made very quick work of them. As I was doing my quick assessment of the situation, I saw a dragon mommy burst through the woods, grab one of the skeletons, and rip them in half like a Wookiee that had just lost a game. I saw something also coming in my HUD. Something big. Out of the forest, three very large quadrupedal green skeletons emerged. One much bigger than the others and seemed to command all the other skeletons around. It strode forward and cut down two of the robot friendlies, and I immediately charged at it. Firing my weapon as I charged, I could hear others firing as well. 3-round bursts, all the way to full automatics, filled the air. Clocking a skeleton on the way by, its head actually came off, to my surprise, and I ran at the largest robotic skeleton. As I did, other quadrupedals got in my way. It swung its giant blade at me, but I slid right underneath it like I was power sliding. Bringing up my weapon, I fired directly into the core of the skeleton, and I quickly found out that the automatic almost completely, well, ineffective to say the least. I was basically chipping paint. Dropping the rifle, I grabbed its leg and pulled as hard as I could. The leg unfortunately didn't come off as I had hoped, but I was actually able to toss it away, and on the ground, as it tried to get back onto its four legs, the neighbors rushed it to tear it apart. Turning around, I saw others trying to take down the last two. In that group, there were others like me, and they manhandled the smaller one, but the big one, well, that was much tougher. With multiple arms, one of which had a very large weapon and another one with a huge metal claw, I drew my shotgun and began to unload. The 10-gauge sable rounds caused it to flinch and use its arms to defend itself, trying to keep any of the rounds away. But I only had so many cartridges before I had to reload. Even though I was making significant progress, I was soon out of ammo. We were far too close for me to stop and reload, so it's time to do what's known as a New York reload. As another shotgun wielder got its attention, I dropped my shotgun and drew the energy blade and charged. The light from the blade seemed to get its attention, and it turned as I swung hard. It raised its own massive blade to stop me, but my energy blade versus its solid hunk of metal was a bad idea. The blue energy of my blade cut clearly through the metal, and for that one section of its blade to continue due to inertia, well, it slammed into me and knocked me off my damn feet. Rolling back to my feet, I looked at this great big giant quadrupedal skeleton as it examined its blade. Now, significantly shorter, this thing was mentally pulled back into the fight as other energy blades came to light all around it with that sickening crash of energy. Along with that, magic wielders began to increase their attack power, getting ready to blast this thing into tiny, tiny little pieces. The sounds of all those energy blades lighting and the sound of magic being charged made the skeleton look around, and even though its face couldn't change expression, I could see fear in its eyes. I smiled under my helmet, ignited my blade, and charged in at the creature with everybody else, intending to cut this big bastard into such small pieces that even the best healers in the world couldn't fix it. After it was all over, those with healing abilities got to work on our wounded. I was fine, so I collected my gear and conversed with the others for a little bit. As it turns out, all those, like me, could hear a voice in their head. Then it hit us like a kick in the nuts. Why didn't we think of that? We all then reached up and withdrew the storage chip that was still glowing from the back of our helmets. From there, we finally got to see the forms that went with those voices. While some of them were creatures like elves, or others were like humans in business attire, while mine looked like a very well shaped lady, maybe 20 years old, and dressed like she was going out to a country bar. Not that I mind, but with her proportions and that short skirt and vest without a blouse left very little to the imagination. That with a very thick southern accent made her very noticeable, and all I could think of is, okay, who designed this one? Each of these suits came with its own AI to assist us, and we realized why. Around the world, different groups were tearing into the population, and without all this assistance, our chances of survival were pretty freaking low. While walking back to the house, I got to share some time and talk with my new companion. I actually gave her the name Anna Marie, but she actually prefers just Marie. On my request, she began looking up videos from all across the planet. As it turns out, these robot skeletons pulled the short straw and ended up here in the US. You know, the one place in the world where there's a rifle behind every blade of grass, every tree, every rock, and there might be an explosive under your foot. Not to mention our own supply of new tech and our high concentration of magic users, it's not exactly the best place to try and invade. All across the country, people took up arms to give the new arrivals a 12-gauge lobotomy. Compiling evidence as we went along, it was clear that out of the 6 different species, 2 of them quickly realized that we could be friends. They might have friends here. The new robot species that's basically has a flat screen for a face, and a different type of elf species that wear the most ridiculous pointy armor I've ever seen. The moment they saw that the elves live here, they stood down. And the same thing with the robots. Good thing too, since they're insanely outnumbered, and I don't use that lightly. It's so ridiculous, it's redonkulous. Looking at all the images flashing past my face, or was it inside my head? I really can't tell. I focused in on a reptilian species and wanted to know what was going on. It was a horrifying species of reptilian insects stretched across the equator. Those that ended up in the ocean during the distortion quickly found out why the Navy calls the ocean liquid hate. If they didn't drown right away, there was exposure to deal with. But before that, there was also a myriad of predators to deal with. With the world's population dropping so fast over the last few years, the overfishing of the oceans had completely stopped. With that factor, the population of the oceans had spiked and allowed many species to get populated and very large. And this included any species that's drawn to anything thrashing on the surface. In the rainforests around near the equator, these species found out that things can bite, sting, infect, and make life very short if you don't know what you're doing. What little video came out of the area shows many of the creatures covered in bites, many of them sitting there suffering from necrosis. There was also a video of one of the smaller creatures, maybe about the size of a medium to large dog, at the northern end of the Brazilian rainforest, finding out that many venomous snakes are in the trees. And the video shows it walking along, then jumping around trying to get the snake off of it. Though it did get the snake off and actually crushed the snake into the ground, the hemotoxin made short work of the creature as it got lethargic and then seemed to just flinch and drop. This makes these giant reptilians almost a non-issue. What the real issues were was currently stretched from Japan all the way to Ireland. Two different species had arrived and were just as interested in killing each other as they were with destroying the local population. One large group seemed to come out of the distortion in Mexico, which was similar to these guys, just south of Mexico City. For some reason, these massive armored people took their division of red energy wielding, green armor wearing humans and began to exterminate everyone and everything. It was like, why? Once they killed everybody in the vicinity, they started heading out in all directions, prompting Marie to give one of the notices. As it turns out, I got an address, and we were all prompted to assemble for transport. We're going to have to stop these things before they can reach the border. Then the alert was suddenly canceled, as the militias of the border state have already begun to assemble and assemble quickly, and they got ready for their march south as they expected. As I finally get to the house, another alert hits me. This time, it's be ready for transportation to the Asian continent. Much of the population is calling for any assistance they can get. They need time to assemble. Taking a deep breath, I pause for a moment before running to the house. There's a lot of vehicles now, and a few broken skeletons in the yard. I curse audibly, realizing that they had actually dissolved all my chickens, though they did leave the garden alone. Showing up the door, it flew open, and a pair of green flesh pushed me over with so much force. Ruby and Hazel had come to greet me and show what they had actually become. I was happy for them both, grateful that they were in health and that they could move around so much, though I realized suddenly what they were pushing against me, and I really, really wished I could feel it through this suit. Our meeting was short-lived as I told everybody that I received a notification and what the notification was. I told them I had to go. I had to help them stop this invasion, and many of them wanted to come along. I lied and told them that only current and former military can go. I reminded them that this is the way it is now. We need to survive, so they would call up the militia to give the actual regulars time to assemble. And once they assemble, they can go in a large group and just wipe everybody out. They say no more than 3 days. Yeah, I call bullshit. But this is what we do. This is who we are. As I was explaining this, Marie's voice came out and scared the hell out of everybody as she tried to correct me. The screams from everybody actually cut off her sentence, and I told her that I was going alone and she needs to zip her digital lip. Showing Marie to everybody after I pulled her out of my helmet, my sisters commented how I had brought another girl, and she said, I figured 3 wives was enough. She said this just to piss me off, and guess what? It worked. Although I didn't have time for this. As all three ladies blushed at the idea, I put Maria back into the socket and said that somebody needs to bring the RV back. Ruby and Hazel wanted to drive and be with me as they dropped me off, but I had to tell them they would actually be causing more accidents, and they actually thought I meant they didn't know how to drive. I know they know how to drive. I taught them. I simply had to remind them as nice as possible that all four of their crash-causing assets were currently hanging out in front of me. I reminded them that when my nephew shows up, his new wife can actually size their clothes, but until then, they just kind of had to stay put. As I was saying this to the girls, each man and boy in the house kept looking at the girls', shall we say, exemplary additions. My brother ended up driving me with my other nephew riding shotgun. Marie jumped into the console just to give them directions while I refitted the armor. After the fight with those robo-skeletons, I wanted to see if there was any other additions. There wasn't much I could do in the limited time, but there were some upgrades, so I did select one. Before leaving the house, I made sure everybody was set up. Amelia even opened up her bunker to secure the youngest ones and those that honestly just can't fight. I could just actually imagine everybody's faces when they find out how roomy and comfortable that bunker is. I should know, I helped her design it myself, along with bringing in a lot of the amenities. The food, the filtration system, all those really comfy beds, the silky nylon linens or whatever that was. I mean, everything there was designed for comfort. It was just the shell that was harder than a rock. As the RV pulled into the parking lot where the transport was coming, over 24 RVs were already there lined up and waiting. I didn't have any more time, so I immediately suited up. My nephew watched and said, "That's the coolest thing I've ever seen." I didn't have time to say anything, as Marie gave me a heads up that the transport was inbound. Before leaving the RV, I picked up one of the holsters with one of my 45s in it. I handed it to my nephew and said, "Protect the family." This would be the first time I let him even touch one of my pistols, so he understood the significance. I told my brother, "As soon as we leave, get this thing back to the farm in one piece, Leadfoot." He grinned at that because I know he just loves drifting with this hover converted stuff. The transport itself looked like a larger Chinook, almost like a giant green Tylenol pill without the rotors. The seating was facing out in 2 rows each ways, with the seats attached to the head deck. As the hatch doors closing, 2 more of those like me ran up and used the thruster engines on their suits to propel themselves into the ship. There was a quick warning about acceleration, and then, oh boy, 5 full minutes, if not 6 or 7, of increased inertia as we took off. Just think of how fast when a plane takes off the tarmac. Now, keep that up about 3 times the force for another 6 minutes, and you'll get the idea. The ship did shudder slightly after the first minute as we broke Mach 1, and we just kept accelerating. I didn't know how fast these things go, but holy crap. On the trip across the ocean, I reviewed the footage from the continent, at least what was coming out. Massive ships in the air fired their broadside cannons at each other as the Earth combined fleet massed on the borders of Finland and Russia. As they did, they made their way south towards Turkey. They left broken enemy ships in their wake as they pushed their way through the formations, not giving a shit how much ordnance they were burning. They just wanted this battle done. They made it just north the Bulgaria border when all the fleet seemed to realize how dangerous the home fleet was, and they converged on it. As it turns out, as tough as they are, all of the alien fleets from this distortion were far more form above any type of function. though imposing. Many enemy ships fell one after another, sometimes taking only a single shot before being penetrated. This, on top of the big swarm of aircraft coming from every direction and being peppered from ground fire. Many of the enemy ships were so confused at the amount of fire they couldn't tell if they were shot, fuck, powder burned, or snake pit, and they just kind of thrashed in every direction, firing wildly, trying to keep everybody away. In desperation, the enemy would single out one of our ships and try to fire just on it. Though a good idea, this left them open to all the other ships, as even the point defense systems would turn that way. The Earth fleet did take losses, but nothing they couldn't have recovered from. One of the frigates actually tried to peel away due to the damage from such a heavy fight, only to lose power and find itself sliding to a stop on the southern end of Sweden, even with the losses they had. The home fleet was tearing them apart, but there was one problem. They were running short of ammunition, and pretty soon they would have to pull themselves out of the combat area to rearm, refit, and reload before they could come back in. Thankfully, they took out pretty much all the big ships. There was a whole bunch of shuttles, but that was all. There was no capital ships left there. But without enough ammo, they would just be giant targets, so they would have to pull back. We would be on our own. Flying at speeds I wasn't sure were possible, we all began to slow down in our transports. Due to all the fire and heat, we would have to terminate at a hover and jump out. I wasn't happy about that. When I jumped out, I actually found myself saying the airborne prayer. Please God, let this thing open. Please God, let this thing open. Landing rather hard, but on my feet, we all began to spread out and kill any invader not already surrendering. As it became a game of shoot, move, and communicate, I could see what these absolute jackholes had done to the beautiful city of Warsaw. Remembering my vacation in that city years ago, I was getting angrier and angrier by the moment as I saw the destruction. Most of what we had dealt with are cybernetic green-skinned muscle heads that fall rather quickly to sustain fire. Though some had very thick armor, it wasn't actually difficult to find a weak spot and simply blow a hole through it. As like the man says, give me the biggest guy in the world, you smash his knee and he'll drop like a rock. Even though my mind was fully in the game, seeing these things we were shooting, I finally realized what happened to the girls. They were now the female version of these things. The difference being, the girls still had the hair in their heads. Thankfully, nowhere else. I checked. And they also had no tusks. Must be their version of sexual dimorphism, I guess. Then I saw one of the others like me taking on a very large group of these things by himself. He just charged in forward with such abandon that we were all like, what the hell are you doing? Then we followed him and we saw. On the ground was a female green-skinned former goblin with bright red hair. On top of her was one of those invaders pulsating, just crashing down into her. That green shit was so invested in what he was doing, he didn't see the giant metal boot coming in and cracking him right in the face, knocking out most of his teeth. As the turd hit the ground, he looked up with blood spewing down his face, just in time to see a shotgun aimed at his newly formed junk. With one blast, the green turd wouldn't hurt anyone else like that ever again, and it would bleed out on the street. I caught up to the one that was freaking out, and another one was checking the woman that had been gang assaulted. I knew he had totally raged out. He had got tunnel vision. I've been there before when you just have to kill something. And I looked around, and it was amazing by the time I got there how many bodies were just on the ground, all of which had their pants down. Before I could actually do it myself, someone had actually broken a shop window and was bringing a drape over to cover the woman. I looked at the woman's bloody face for a moment, and she looked like she could be Ruby or Hazel's sister, with the difference being the rich, long red hair she had. I didn't have time to think, as the drape was placed over her body to give her just some respect for her honor, and I helped the man place the drape over her. Then I saw the medic that was treating her reach up, close her eyes, and then with his other hand reach and grab the drape and pull it up over her face. Without a word, Doc paused and then struck his fist into the ground as hard as he could, leaving a giant dent in the asphalt. And all those in the square had blood boil with rage at what had just happened. No words were spoken. No words had to be spoken. And for the next 2 days, we didn't sleep. We didn't eat. We only cared about one thing: finding those fucking green shits and giving them the hard goodbye. And when their eyes go dead, the hell we send them to will feel like heaven after what we've done to them. Some of the green turds were caught feasting on the remains of those they killed, too. Men, women, children, the race, species, it didn't matter at all to them. Since they were hungry, we, along with the local forces, would give them something to chew on, and that would be a whole lot of lead. Stopping only to reload from the supply caches dropped. These beasts tried to grab women and retreat off into the distance to run away from us. As they did, they ran headlong into the last invading army that was on the planet. This group of armored humans, along with their support units, would slaughter the green turds almost as effectively as us. Seeing this, we believe we may have another ally in these armored humans. We were wrong. The moment we did not submit, the moment we did not prostrate ourselves in their presence, the moment we didn't claim loyalty to them or whatever the hell they were saying, or most of all, if we protected any non-human allies, they began to fire instantly. Behind them rolled a myriad of different vehicles, like their ships, far more form beyond function, yet there was still plenty of them, with more shuttles even approaching, bringing even more. I figured, we are dead. We are so very, very dead. As I fired from behind cover, I could hear Mary's voice saying, "Rapid Dragon incoming. Time on target. 10 seconds." Everyone must have heard it from their own AI, because we all just dove for cover wherever we could. The mass of LRES missiles whipped past us in a massive volley. Tanks, APCs, transports, anything bigger than a person was absolutely annihilated. The explosions themselves were bad, but they would set off the secondary explosions, which were enough to take out a majority of the enemy foot soldiers, those not encased in armor, with the concussion blast and the shrapnel that sprayed everywhere. I barely missed the front end of one of their APCs that flew right past and was buried into a concrete wall, actually through it and into the building. Once the round's complete, I got up, grabbed my rifle, and immediately dropped it as it was busted in several pieces. Picking myself up, I joined the chorus of screams as we showed our war face before charging directly at the enemy. Through the dust cloud left from the strike, we charged the location where the biggest threat was. As we got close, Marie yelled at me saying, "Enemy energy weapon fully charged!" Realizing what was about to happen, I yelled as loud as I could, "Get behind me!" As I drew the energy shield off my hip, turned it on with its round blue glow. I also activated the upgrade, which was a second shield that looked much more rectangular. Then I cranked the shield around my armor to its absolute maximum. I did this moments before we heard the enemy cry, "Burn, heretic!" As the burst of energy made its way like a slow shockwave, anyone outside of a suit burst into flames, cooking from the inside out and the outside in. Those in suits, without any shields, screamed in pain and fell to the ground. On my HUD, I could read that they were alive. Barely. After the wave, I dropped the handheld shield. It had actually overloaded due to stress and was completely and totally fried, but it had saved my life. Through the dust, I could see some still charging as they had not been caught up in the blast radius. Those that had listened to my scream and jumped behind me ran past me as well, hell-bent on killing those motherless freaks that just burned a whole bunch of our buddies. Running a very quick check of my armor, it still functions, which is really good as the shooting is starting again. I thought for a moment and then realized what I had to do. With a burst of thrust, I ended up high in the air. Coming down, I drew my energy blade and guided myself right into the one with that stupid energy weapon that looked like a totem, for crying out loud. And he looked up just in time to see who was about to punch his ticket. He was standing in the center of a formation of 9 armored zealots. I drove the blade through his face, right through his armor, and before it could react, I activated the arm shield that it knocked over their heavy machine gunner. Pulling my energy blade out of the head, I had just enough time to swing it sideways to deflect the point-blank shots that were aimed right at me. The inertia of the bullets flew me off to the side and put me right on my ass, and I looked up to see who was about to punch my ticket. In slow motion, I saw him level that big fucking gun, only to take a 10-gauge slug, one right after another, into his back. As he turned away from me, the power of his suit actually failed, and the sudden weight of the suit and that massive gun in his hand pulled him right to the ground. He would be the lone survivor, as the others would fall under withering fire of those that had charged the lines. Those armored zealots may have had 2 hearts, 4 lungs, 6 kidneys, 8 livers, and God knows what else. But that won't do any good when you have 1,000 people who want to perforate every single one of those organs. So much so that we could change their designation from human to spaghetti strainer. Getting to my feet, I thanked them for pulling my ass out of the fire. The worst part was, that was just round 1. From the far side comes a large group of black armored banshees firing the same type of weapon as their male counterpart. Diving for cover, I drew the shotgun off my back, realizing I have a grand total of 2 cartridges left, and that's not gonna get me far. Putting my head against the piece of rock I was hiding behind, I said, "Marie, please tell me they can finally get us some air support?" Her response was, "I'll do you one better. Look to your left, sugar." I looked, and armor was rolling through the plains, firing the main guns straight through the city, and these upgraded Gripens and other fixed-wing aircraft strafed the area, filling the sky as they whipped past. As missiles streaked in, strafing runs came. Heat rounds, high-explosive anti-tank, blew everything in the enemy lines apart. The advance of the Night Witches seemed to be short-lived, as the main force had finally arrived. Massive armored suits covered in weapons began to walk past as they fired over my head. These things are simply covered in guns, and they still have those strange turbines on the back. As they walked forwards, airstrikes cut off the retreat of those that had just tried to push through us. The support units behind them came in, and I waved them down to take the prisoner. The invader simply reaches up with the one hand that he can lift, removes his helmet, showing that he's like Superman on steroids. A lot of steroids. He looks up, and through the translator he says, "I would rather you just kill me." I look down, remove my helmet as a sign of respect, and say, "Tough shit." As they took him away, the battle wound down for us. But before I got a chance to even reload my magazines, two of those night witches are sent flying through a wall thanks to a massive explosion, and one slides to a stop right next to me and a few others. Stepping on the arm trying to raise her weapon, I turned my shotgun to her face, definitely not letting her know that the damn thing's out of ammo. I place it against the eyepiece and say, "Your battle is over." She then uses her free hand to slowly reach up, raise her face cover so I can see that pretty young face with flowing white hair. Those green eyes she has seems to try and put a hole through my soul as she looks up. She says, "I die for the Emperor in his name." Before I can say anything, another soldier says, "Tough shit," before putting the restraints on her. I add, "Besides, I'd rather not damage something so pretty." She seems confused as the restraints were put on. As I step away, one of the commander jokes, "That's multiple prisoners. Are you sure you're not related to Sergeant York?" I didn't really care about the quip, really. The battle was over for me, and it's time to lick my wounds. Then again, with the changes the girls had, I think there's something else I'd rather lick. It didn't take too long to get transportation back home. I made sure to call the girls and everybody else, let them know that I'm still alive, because they were freaking out because the battle was, well, saying it was bad was being nice. On the flight back, I figured I'd finally get some sleep. I would if it wasn't for the message sent to us from the original AI, the one that came in before. Seeing that naked blue hologram woke me up just a little bit, but what she was going to tell us definitely had me awake because it was going to change everything. Hello, everybody. This is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on today's chapter. Before I go, I need to send out a quick thank you to one of my very special supporters. That would be Erica Gem. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Everyone else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.